Imagine a being of fire and vengeance, unstoppable and beyond death, riding through the galaxy where no law or army can touch him. What happens when Ghost Rider enters the brutal universe of Warhammer 40K, where gods, demons, and superhuman warriors clash endlessly? Will he survive? Or burn them all? Ghost Rider's sudden arrival in the grimdark universe of Warhammer 40K was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. One moment, the stars burned with the cold light of distant suns, and the next, a new terrifying presence tore through the void, shrouded in flames that seemed to burn with a fire not of this universe. The skeletal figure atop his hellish motorcycle emerged from a rift between realities, a swirling vortex of energy that pulsed with a dark, almost sacred resonance. His flaming skull glowed with an intensity that no star could match, casting an eerie, flickering light across the void. Entire fleets of Imperial Navy ships that had been patrolling the edge of a star system were momentarily blinded by the sudden glare, their sensors overwhelmed by the raw, supernatural energy that emanated from him. Even the most seasoned navigators and astropaths of the Imperium, trained to perceive disturbances in the warp and to sense psychic presences across vast distances, could feel the weight of his arrival pressing upon their minds. It was as if the laws of reality themselves had shifted, bending to accommodate a force that was not bound by the ordinary rules of time, space, or physics. As Ghost Rider descended toward the surface of a war-torn world, the landscape seemed to react to his presence. The very air shimmered with heat and unnatural energy, and the scorched ground beneath him cracked and splintered as though acknowledging the intrusion of something divine and terrible. Forests ignited without wind, cities felt a sudden oppressive heat, and the cries of the dying mingled with an almost otherworldly hum that emanated from the rider. His chain, ablaze with hellfire, whipped through the air with a crackle that sounded like the snapping of the very fabric of reality. Where his tires met the ground, the soil was burned to cinder, leaving behind trails of blackened, smoking earth. And even the metallic hulls of nearby vehicles warped and blistered from the intensity of the flames. Mortals on the surface, whether Imperial guardsmen, civilians, or even the unholy servants of chaos, looked upon him with a mixture of awe and terror, instinctively knowing that this was no ordinary warrior or psyker, but something far beyond the scope of human understanding. The Imperium, with its immense bureaucracy and countless worlds under its control, had never encountered anything that could rival the sheer raw power of Ghost Rider. Entire planetary defense networks sprang into action, Lascannon batteries charging, void shields activating, and tactical fleets moving to intercept the rider before he could reach critical areas. Yet, despite the overwhelming firepower directed at him, Ghost Rider moved with a supernatural ease, his bike defying all known laws of mechanics and propulsion. Energy beams, missiles, and plasma fire struck him, only to dissipate harmlessly against his hellish aura. Even psychic projections meant to immobilize or confuse him were met with a chilling intensity, as though he could sense the sins and guilt of those who attempted to harm him, turning their own intentions against them in subtle and terrifying ways. The chaos forces lurking in the galaxy sensed an immediate disruption. Demons of the warp writhed in agitation, their forms flickering and shifting as though threatened by the spectral rider. Sorcerers who had long studied the arts of dark sorcery found their incantations faltering, their rituals corrupted by the presence of a power that seemed to punish sin itself. The very essence of chaos, the raw and malleable energy of the warp, recoiled at his intrusion. Where they sought to spread corruption and dominate the galaxy, Ghost Rider's arrival represented a force that operated on a completely different scale, one that was rooted in judgment, vengeance, and an unyielding supernatural mandate. Even entities such as greater demons and bloodthirsters felt the pressure of his presence, recognizing, if only instinctively, that here was a being who was neither mortal nor fully warp-touched, but something entirely different. something that could challenge their dominance and turn their own ferocity against them. Ghost Rider's appearance was not merely a visual spectacle. It was a statement of intent. His every movement carried an air of inevitability, a sense that nothing could alter his purpose. Even from orbit, astropaths and telepaths aboard Imperial vessels reported visions of fiery landscapes, screams of judgment, and chains that lashed through the void, striking down unseen enemies. These visions were accompanied by an oppressive sense of guilt and fear, emotions that were magnified in those who harbored darkness in their hearts. Soldiers who had faced tyrannid swarms, orc waghs, and the horrors of chaos alike found themselves trembling, their minds assaulted by a presence that was as much spiritual and psychic as it was physical. As Ghost Rider made his descent to the planet's surface, the inhabitants of nearby systems could see the streak of fire across the skies, a comet of vengeance that refused to be ignored. Cities paused mid-battle, armies halted mid-charge, and even the most hardened veterans of the Imperium found their hearts quickening. The chains he wielded seemed to move with a will of their own, lashing at enemy fortifications, vehicles, and troops with unerring precision. The flames that surrounded him did not merely burn flesh and metal. They seared sin and corruption, leaving behind a trail of purity in their wake, a paradoxical cleansing fire that terrified both mortals and demons alike. It became immediately clear that Ghost Rider was not bound by allegiance or loyalty to any faction in the galaxy. His arrival was an anomaly, a cosmic force that had crossed dimensions and now imposed its own rules upon the chaotic battlefield of the 41st millennium. Even the sensors of advanced Imperial warships, designed to detect the slightest anomaly in the void, struggled to comprehend his nature. Readings fluctuated wildly, energy signatures spiking to impossible levels before vanishing entirely, leaving commanders bewildered. Astropathic communications were similarly disrupted, their messages becoming distorted with images of fire, skulls, and chains. The Imperium's clerical and religious authorities began debating whether this was a manifestation of the Emperor's will, a vengeful spirit from some forgotten myth, or an unknown entity entirely. Temples were thrown into fervent activity, chaplains attempting to interpret omens while the faithful prayed for protection, their voices rising in unison against a presence that was neither wholly malevolent nor entirely benevolent, but undeniably powerful. The Imperium of man, vast and unyielding as it was, could not ignore the sudden appearance of a new, terrifying presence streaking across their star systems. Reports began trickling in from distant worlds almost immediately, worlds that had long been accustomed to the horrors of constant war. Worlds scarred by the endless campaigns of the Imperium and the constant threat of Xenos and heretics. Yet none of these worlds had ever seen anything like what was now manifesting across their skies. Entire cities reported fires that ignited without wind or natural cause. Structures burned to their foundations with an eerie swiftness, and strange, ghostly figures were seen moving among the chaos, their skeletal forms glowing with a light that seemed both infernal and divine. It was not just the destruction that caught the attention of planetary governors and military commanders, but the supernatural quality of the events. Soldiers described seeing a figure on a flaming motorcycle, chains lashing through the air, and a skull that burned with hellfire, leaving trails of radiant fire in its wake. The descriptions were consistent across hundreds of reports, from Hive Cities to agri-worlds, creating an undeniable pattern that demanded recognition from the highest echelons of the Imperium. The Imperium's response was swift, if chaotic. Fleet commanders ordered patrols to intercept and assess the anomaly, deploying squadrons of battleships, cruisers, and frigates to the reported coordinates. Void shields activated and torpedoes were armed, while Imperial Navy gunners braced for engagement. Yet as these formidable forces approached, the phenomenon became even more perplexing. Sensors picked up a signature unlike anything they had cataloged, an energy reading that fluctuated violently, sometimes appearing to occupy multiple locations simultaneously, then disappearing entirely. The most advanced warships of the Imperium could not lock onto the source with any degree of certainty. Targeting systems failed to compensate for the supernatural velocity and unpredictability of this figure. And even the most seasoned admirals found themselves staring in disbelief at tactical readouts that defied all logic. It was as though the rider were untethered from conventional space and time, moving in ways that no machine, no calculation, could predict. Reports from planetary surfaces were no less alarming. Imperial guardsmen and local defense forces found themselves facing a foe that could not be contained by bullets, bolter rounds, or lascannon fire. Entire regiments attempted to engage, only to watch as their weaponry either passed harmlessly through the rider's flaming form or detonated with little effect against his hellish aura. Some units claimed that merely witnessing the rider was enough to instill paralyzing fear. Men dropped to their knees, their hearts gripped by a terror that seemed to emanate from the rider himself rather than the flames or chains. Chaplains and priests of the Imperial Creed attempted to rally the faithful, invoking prayers to the Emperor. Yet even their most fervent invocations seemed to have limited impact against the supernatural intensity of the figure streaking across the skies. It became clear to all observers that this was no ordinary entity, and that traditional military response alone would be insufficient. As reports continued to pour in, the nature of the threat, or perhaps the phenomenon, began to reveal itself. Ghost Rider did not act like a conventional invader. There was purpose and judgment in his movements rather than the chaotic destruction typical of Xenos or heretic attacks. He did not indiscriminately slaughter, yet wherever he appeared, corruption, sin, and violence seemed to be punished with an unerring precision. Imperial authorities began to speculate whether this was a divine force, a rogue demon, or some unknown warp-touched entity. The Inquisition convened emergency sessions, debating the possibility that the rider represented either a weapon from an alternate dimension or an anomaly so profound that it could challenge their understanding of the warp itself. Psychers reported strange visions, feeling the presence of a being that seemed to peer into their very souls, discerning guilt, fear, and sin with uncanny accuracy. These psychic impressions caused panic among some, while others, those trained in the discipline of the astropathy, viewed it as an opportunity to gain insight into the nature of the warp and the influence of external realities upon it. The local populations were caught between awe and terror. Hive Cities, usually accustomed to the constant noise of war and the ever-present threat of rebellion, found themselves staring at skies streaked with fire. Trails of molten hellfire winding through urban canyons, leaving terrified civilians to wonder if they were witnessing divine wrath or the herald of annihilation. Workers, traders, and militia alike abandoned their routines to watch the spectacle, some falling to their knees in prayer, others screaming in horror as entire sectors of their worlds were scorched in moments. Even the most hardened planetary governors and military officers had to acknowledge the extraordinary nature of the event. Communications networks buzzed with frantic messages, reports overlapping, conflicting, and creating a tapestry of chaos that mirrored the impact of the rider himself. The Imperium's vast bureaucracy, normally slow and ponderous, had to adapt at unprecedented speed to gather intelligence, assess damage, and attempt to respond. The chaos forces lurking in the shadows were equally unsettled. Demons, accustomed to preying on mortal weakness and manipulating the currents of the warp to their advantage, found themselves confronted with a power that seemed immune to their influence. Sorcerers attempting to conjure demonic entities reported disruptions in their spells, and the most malevolent servants of the chaos gods experienced sudden, inexplicable pain or fear, as though some unseen hand punished them for their sins. The presence of the rider disrupted the delicate equilibrium that chaos maintained in various sectors, forcing Daemons and mortal cultists alike to reconsider their positions. Some fled, terrified by the specter of judgment incarnate, while others attempted desperate, reckless attacks that only served to highlight their vulnerability against a being whose power transcended mortal comprehension. Meanwhile, the Imperium's strategic command began to implement larger-scale measures. Entire fleets were redeployed, planetary defenses were reinforced, and orders were issued to monitor every possible ingress and egress point in affected star systems. Yet, despite these efforts, the rider continued to move unimpeded, appearing where he was least expected, striking at corrupted sites, punishing criminal elements, and leaving trails of fire that seared the memory of all who witnessed them. Imperial analysts, engineers, and theologians worked feverishly to understand his origin, debating whether this was a herald of the Emperor, a manifestation of a higher cosmic justice, or an entirely alien force beyond their understanding. Each theory carried its own implications, and the uncertainty only heightened the tension across the galaxy as fleets, armies, and planetary governors scrambled to adapt to an event that defied all precedent. Chaos forces across the galaxy were immediately unsettled by the sudden and unexpected arrival of Ghost Rider, a being whose very presence seemed to disrupt the fragile balance of power that chaos had spent millennia cultivating. The warp, usually a fluid and malleable medium in which demons and sorcerers could bend reality to their will, reacted violently to his intrusion, roiling and twisting as if in protest. Greater demons, those titanic manifestations of the chaos gods themselves, felt a tension in the warp that they had not encountered even in the fiercest battles against the Imperium. Sorcerers and cult leaders who had grown accustomed to manipulating dark energies with practiced precision found their spells faltering, their incantations disrupted by a force that seemed to punish sin and corruption directly. Every curse, every summoning, every attempt to call forth the dark energies of the warp was met with interference. Subtle at first, then more overt, as if an unseen hand moved to correct the balance and prevent the manifestation of unchecked malevolence. Demons, who thrived on fear, chaos, and mortal suffering, reacted in terror to Ghost Rider's presence. Lesser demons twitched and recoiled as he approached, their forms flickering as if the flames surrounding him burned not only flesh and armor, but the very essence of their corruption. The pits of chaos, where mortal souls were claimed and twisted into instruments of the dark gods, seemed to shudder in anticipation, sensing a force that could not be contained by the machinations of the warp. Sorcerers who had been manipulating entire systems to serve the whims of their patron deities found themselves losing control over their minions, the demons turning on one another in confusion, sensing the approach of a force that judged beyond the petty allegiances of the mortal and immortal alike. The influence of Ghost Rider was not merely physical. It penetrated psychic and spiritual realms, a presence that forced chaos to confront a power whose existence seemed antithetical to the dark. Corrupting energies they relied upon, bloodthirsters, those towering avatars of rage and violence, felt an unfamiliar unease. The primal fury that usually drove them unchecked across battlefields was met with a counterforce that demanded reckoning, where they sought to tear, burn, and slaughter indiscriminately. Ghost Rider punished with precision, targeting not the strongest or the weakest, but the guilty, the corrupt, and the unruly, leaving a trail of judgment that the Chaos Warriors could neither comprehend nor escape. Entire battlefields shifted in their dynamics as his presence forced demonic forces to operate differently, to anticipate retribution that could come in forms they had never encountered. This altered not only the strategies of Chaos generals, but also their confidence. For the certainty of victory that often fueled their campaigns was now replaced by doubt, a subtle but potent destabilization that echoed through ranks of mortal and immortal followers alike. Chaos sorcerers attempting to summon greater demons from the warp experienced phenomena that bordered on the incomprehensible. Ritual circles burned with an unnatural intensity as the air around them warped, preventing the controlled summoning of entities they had meticulously prepared for. The spells that usually bent reality to their will instead backfired or misfired, sometimes drawing the sorcerers into fleeting glimpses of otherworldly landscapes, fiery chasms, and skeletal riders who moved with terrifying inevitability. The connection between the warp and mortal manipulation of its energy seemed strained, twisted by the intrusion of a force that was neither fully mortal nor fully demon, yet capable of existing in both realms simultaneously. These disturbances extended beyond the immediate presence of Ghost Rider, radiating outward to warp nexuses, cult strongholds, and corrupted planets, creating zones where chaos influence faltered and the natural laws of malevolence seemed inverted. Even mortal followers of chaos, those who had devoted their lives to the worship of the dark gods, felt the impact of his arrival. Cultists cowered, unsure whether the figure they witnessed was an agent of the Emperor, a rogue demon, or something beyond mortal comprehension entirely. Commands from their superiors often faltered under the pressure of instinctive fear, leading to disarray within even the most disciplined warbands. The confidence that chaos leaders derived from their ability to manipulate mortal followers and demonic allies was undermined by a force that operated on principles alien to their understanding, one that punished and judged rather than seduced or corrupted. Desperation set in as these leaders sought new strategies to contain, evade, or combat a foe that could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or destroyed through conventional means. The warp itself seemed to convulse at Ghost Rider's presence. Storms of psychic energy, normally under the control of chaos entities, shifted unpredictably, creating turbulence that threatened to destabilize entire sectors. Warp rifts opened and closed spontaneously. Demons were drawn into or repelled from areas where their presence had been assured, and the usual signals that guided warp navigation became erratic, endangering entire fleets attempting to traverse the Imperium. Even chaos gods themselves, for whom mortal perception of the warp was but a fraction of their domain, felt the perturbation in the grand tapestry of corruption they had woven. While none could directly confront Ghost Rider without expending immense energy, the ripples of his arrival forced adjustments in their strategies, subtle manipulations that sought to mitigate the influence of a being who could not be fully predicted or controlled. The tension was not limited to psychic or spiritual dimensions. It manifested physically on battlefields where chaos had established dominion. Entire formations of Chaos Space Marines hesitated as Ghost Rider appeared, their chains, claws, and plasma rifles seemingly ineffective against a rider who could traverse ground and air with supernatural speed. Greater demons were challenged in combat in ways that defied their previous encounters with mortals, or even other demonic entities. Entire campaigns were disrupted, as strongholds once thought impregnable found themselves vulnerable to a force whose motivations did not align with those of the Imperium, yet whose effect on chaos was immediately devastating. The unpredictable nature of his strikes, targeting sin and corruption rather than tactical advantage, created confusion and fear, destabilizing hierarchies, and forcing demonic generals and mortal champions alike to reconsider the nature of power in a galaxy that was already precariously balanced between order and chaos. In the presence of Ghost Rider, chaos forces learned quickly that traditional strength and intimidation held little value. His power did not come from allegiance to a god, from manipulation of the warp, or from sheer martial might. It came from a fundamental ability to punish, to judge, and to impose consequence with unerring precision. The psychological impact alone was enough to sow disarray, making soldiers question their purpose, leaders question their authority, and demons question their very existence. Every confrontation with the rider left an indelible mark, a lingering sense of dread that persisted long after he had departed, reshaping the strategies and fears of chaos forces for years to come. Orcs, the green-skinned brutes of the galaxy, were among the first Xenos to react to the sudden and inexplicable arrival of Ghost Rider, and their response was as chaotic and violent as one might expect. To the Orcs, the flaming skeletal rider was unlike any mech, warboss, or fighter they had ever seen, a being of pure destruction and fire that seemed to radiate power beyond comprehension. News spread quickly through the warp-linked minds of the Wa, reaching boys across countless planets and space hulks. Wherever Ghost Rider appeared, mobs of orcs converged, drawn by the instinctual urge to fight the strongest opponent, to challenge a force that promised the most glorious of battles. But what they encountered was not a conventional enemy. Ghost Rider did not charge, roar, or cackle like a warboss, and he did not wield the crude, ballistic weaponry orcs so loved. Instead, he moved with a supernatural grace atop a motorcycle that left trails of hellfire across the terrain, and he wielded chains that struck with surgical precision. The orcs were initially baffled, their instincts screaming that this was a challenge worthy of a Wog. Yet every attack they launched seemed either to be deflected effortlessly or to rebound in unexpected ways, leaving them charred, scattered, or otherwise incapacitated. The first engagement set the tone for how orcs would perceive and react to this new threat. Small mobs attempted to swarm him, hoping that overwhelming numbers could achieve what individual strength could not. Clans led by knobs hurled crude explosives and swung massive power claws, only to find that their weapons either disintegrated against his hellfire or failed to make contact with his spectral form. Rocks and trucks that charged at him exploded in showers of metal and sparks when the chains of Ghost Rider wrapped around them, yanking them apart with brutal efficiency. Even the largest warbosses, whose reputations for near invincibility were legendary among orc kind, found themselves forced to retreat, stunned by a power that neither their cunning nor their brute strength could overcome. To the orcs, this was both infuriating and exhilarating. Here was a challenge unlike any they had ever faced. And yet, for all their aggression and rage, the rider's superiority was undeniable. Orcs, being instinct-driven and fueled by their love of combat, began to adapt in unpredictable ways. They attempted coordinated attacks, forming lines of boys with shooters and choppas, hoping that overwhelming firepower combined with sheer recklessness could subdue this mysterious figure. Mob after mob charged, yet each encounter ended the same, a searing trail of fire where the orcs had been. Screams and laughter mingled in chaos, and Ghost Rider moved onward as though unbothered. The warbosses, frustrated by repeated failure, called upon their most elite units, the commandos and meganobs, to strike from shadows and flanks. But even these covert operations were met with uncanny awareness. Ghost Rider seemed to sense every orc's intent, reading the raw aggression and malevolence in their hearts, and responding with calculated strikes that dismantled formations before they could even execute their plans. The orcs were enraged yet invigorated, interpreting the supernatural endurance and speed of the rider as a challenge worthy of legend, something that would be sung about in war chants and tales for generations. The impact of Ghost Rider on the larger WAAGH campaigns was immediate and profound. Entire planetary invasions, previously carefully orchestrated by orc strategists, descended into disarray as the rider appeared unpredictably across battlefields, punishing select targets with hellfire and chains while leaving others untouched, creating confusion and frustration. Orcs, who thrived on simple rules of engagement, fight bigger, hit harder, and take what they want, found themselves faced with a force that could not be measured in strength, size, or cunning. Their traditional advantage of overwhelming numbers was neutralized by a single rider whose speed and supernatural judgment dictated the flow of battle in ways they could not anticipate. Entire squads of boys found themselves either incinerated or scattered by chains that seemed to move with a mind of their own, twisting through the chaos and punishing those whose instincts had guided them to aggression while sparing others. leaving a perplexing pattern that even the most intelligent knobs could not fully interpret. Mech boys, obsessed with technology and constructing increasingly elaborate weapons and contraptions to dominate their foes, were particularly vexed by Ghost Rider. The flames surrounding him melted guns and armor with little effort, and even their most sophisticated energy weapons struggled to penetrate his supernatural aura. Attempts to build massive war machines specifically designed to trap or crush the rider often resulted in catastrophic failures, as the forces they unleashed were either absorbed or redirected by the chains in Hellfire. These failures did not dissuade the orcs, who reveled in destruction, but they did contribute to a growing sense of awe and fear. Ghost Rider was not just another target to fight. He was a phenomenon that challenged the orcs' understanding of strength, cunning, and warfare itself, forcing even the most belligerent warbosses to reconsider their approach. Despite the relentless attacks, Ghost Rider's movements retained a sense of purpose. He did not annihilate indiscriminately, but targeted those who posed a threat or embodied excessive aggression. Orcs, unable to interpret his motives fully, became increasingly frenzied, their attacks growing wilder and more erratic as they sought to assert dominance over this inexplicable figure. Skulls were shattered, vehicles destroyed, and entire squads of boys incinerated, yet the rider continued his path unimpeded. This dynamic created a strange pattern of fear and fascination. Orcs, driven by their instinctual desire to confront the strongest, could not resist pursuing him, yet they were continually reminded of their mortality and the limits of their power. Even the largest-scale WAAG events involving thousands of orcs across multiple worlds were disrupted by Ghost Rider's presence. Campaigns that had seemed destined for conquest were thrown into chaos as his sudden appearances on battlefields forced orcs to abandon formations, retreat from engagements, or face annihilation. The natural tendency of orcs to charge blindly at the strongest opponent was exploited by Ghost Rider, whose chains and Hellfire made even the most reckless assaults perilous. The psychological impact was profound. Orcs, normally immune to fear and intimidation, began to hesitate, observing the spectral rider with a mixture of awe and confusion. Their instincts conflicted between the desire to fight and the recognition of an opponent unlike any they had ever faced. In this way, Ghost Rider became an unstoppable force of chaos within the orc psyche, a paradoxical figure whose presence both enraged and fascinated them. His supernatural speed, the precision of his attacks, and the burning judgment he carried challenged every assumption orcs had about battle, strength, and dominance. Entire battlefields were transformed by his actions, leaving scorched earth, scattered bodies, and a lingering sense of awe among survivors. Even in retreat, orcs could not escape the mental and instinctive impressions left by the rider, their dreams and war chants forever haunted by the image of a skeletal figure on a flaming motorcycle, chains lashing through the air, and a fire that seemed to burn through the very essence of their being. The Eldar, masters of grace, speed, and psychic sophistication, sensed the arrival of Ghost Rider with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and growing apprehension. Unlike the crude, instinct-driven orcs or the raw brutality of chaos forces, the Eldar approached the disturbance in their perception of the galaxy with measured observation, attempting to understand the nature and purpose of this anomalous entity. Their seers and farseers, attuned to the subtle currents of the webway and the shifting energies of the warp, immediately detected a ripple unlike any they had encountered before. This ripple was not the chaotic fluctuation of the warp that they had spent millennia studying and manipulating. It was something more singular, more defined, yet equally potent. It pulsed with a sense of inevitability and judgment, as if a force had entered their universe with the sole purpose of righting wrongs, exacting vengeance, and imposing a will that defied mortal and immortal, comprehension alike. The Eldar's first instinct was to observe from a distance. Using their craftworld's sophisticated sensor, arrays and the webway's hidden paths to track the movements of the flaming rider. Unlike most other races, they did not immediately rush to engagement, recognizing that any misstep in interpreting his motives could lead to disastrous consequences. The Farseers convened, consulting their divinations and casting threads of psychic foresight across multiple timelines and potential futures. Even with their unmatched mastery over precognition, they found that Ghost Rider's trajectory and intent were difficult to predict. Unlike enemies bound by political, spiritual, or martial agendas, he moved according to principles that were alien to Eldar logic. His actions were not dictated by conquest, survival, or domination, but by a supernatural code of judgment, a force that responded to the corruption, sin, and malice of those he encountered. This unpredictability created a profound unease among the Eldar, while they had faced entities of immense power before chaos gods, Tyranids, and even renegade Aldari. The arrival of Ghost Rider presented a type of power that was immune to conventional manipulations of the warp, sorcerous attacks, psychic probes, and teleportation attempts yielded inconsistent results, sometimes barely affecting him, and sometimes triggering reactions that were almost surgical in their precision. Entire webway routes that had been secure became hazardous zones as the rider's presence seemed to radiate across dimensions, affecting not only the material realm, but the paths of the webway itself. Eldar navigators reported disturbances in travel, subtle shifts in the psychic currents that guided their paths, and faint echoes of burning energy that seemed to stain even the protected corridors of the webway. The Eldar's military forces were also put on alert. Though they were wary of direct confrontation, aspect warriors and Farseer-guided strike teams observed the rider's movements, attempting to gauge whether he posed a threat to Eldar worlds, craft worlds, or interests. What they observed was simultaneously alarming and perplexing. Ghost Rider did not engage indiscriminately, nor did he attack without cause. Entire battlefields under his influence were transformed, yet the targets of his punishment were selective. Corrupt warlords, demonic incursions, and groups engaged in excess or cruelty were visited with a fiery judgment that left little doubt of his power, while the innocent or neutral often emerged unscathed. This selective enforcement puzzled the Eldar, who were accustomed to calculating the consequences of every action, every ripple of conflict. Yet here was a force acting according to principles entirely beyond their understanding, guided by a moral or cosmic code that intersected the physical and spiritual planes with absolute authority. Seers attempted to pierce the nature of the rider's soul, casting psychic probes to understand the origin, alignment, and limits of his power. The results were inconsistent and sometimes frightening. Where they expected to find mortal corruption, they encountered judgment. Where they anticipated chaos or malice, they perceived inevitability and fire. Even the mightiest Eldar psychers felt their visions clouded or redirected, seeing reflections of flames, skeletal faces, and chains in place of the precise threads of destiny they were accustomed to reading. The subtle manipulations of the warp that usually guided Eldar planning and influence seemed to falter in his presence, leaving them with the sense that this was a force that operated outside the established paradigms of fate and psychic causality. The Eldar also observed the effect he had on other factions, and this observation deepened their apprehension. Arcs reacted with confusion and rage, chaos forces recoiled or faltered, and even Imperial forces were caught between awe and fear. Ghost Rider's mere presence altered the strategies of entire campaigns, rendering carefully laid plans unreliable and introducing an element of unpredictability that could not be countered by superior firepower, psychic ability, or cunning. For the Eldar, who relied on foresight and precision to navigate the perils of the galaxy, this unpredictability was deeply unsettling. They recognized that if left unchecked, the rider could disrupt not only their own activities, but the delicate balance among other powers. causing conflicts to erupt in ways that could destabilize entire sectors. Despite their caution, curiosity compelled the Eldar to consider engagement, though always from a perspective of observation and limited intervention. Strike teams were dispatched to monitor encounters, to record the effects of his attacks on other races, and to test whether any known weapons, psychic techniques, or tactical maneuvers could influence him. These attempts were met with limited success. His supernatural speed, judgment-based targeting, and immunity to conventional interference rendered most tests inconclusive. Even the most powerful Eldar artifacts, designed to manipulate energy, the warp, or the physical environment, struggled against the purity and inevitability of his power. The Eldar's response was therefore a combination of awe, fear, and pragmatic calculation. They began to consider potential alliances, temporary or otherwise, with forces that might also be affected by Ghost Rider, understanding that coordination could mitigate the unpredictable consequences of his actions. At the same time, they remained wary of direct confrontation, knowing that misjudging the rider could result in devastating losses or unintended consequences. Their communications reflected a sense of urgency, debating whether this entity represented a threat, a tool, or a natural phenomenon that must be studied and understood before any course of action could be determined. The ripple effects of Ghost Rider's presence extended beyond immediate military and psychic considerations. Eldar mystics and philosophers pondered the implications of a being that judged according to principles that seemed almost universal, capable of crossing dimensions and acting upon moral imperatives with precision. Discussions arose regarding the nature of judgment, vengeance, and cosmic balance, and whether this entity represented a force aligned with some universal law beyond the comprehension of mortal or immortal minds. The Eldar's historical memory, spanning tens of thousands of years, provided no precedent for such an intrusion, and the implications for future strategy, diplomacy, and even survival were profound. As Ghost Rider continued to traverse the galaxy, his path intersected with Eldar interests in unpredictable ways. He punished aggressors, disrupted battles, and left trails of fire and judgment that altered the outcomes of conflicts without apparent bias or favor. The Eldar observed, recording and analyzing each encounter, seeking patterns and principles that could guide future interaction. While some among their number feared that the rider could become an uncontrollable force, others speculated on the potential benefits of a being capable of enforcing judgment across the galaxy, capable of tipping the scales in favor of balance when neither chaos nor Imperium could maintain order. Ghost Rider's confrontation with a bloodthirster unfolded with a scale and intensity that few in the galaxy could have imagined. The bloodthirster, a towering avatar of Khorne, brimming with rage, fury, and centuries of battle experience, had never encountered a force that moved with such inexorable purpose. Its leathery wings flared wide as it descended from the warp, the air around it vibrating with the sheer magnitude of its presence. Flames and blood-red energy radiated outward, a palpable aura of violence that could drive lesser mortals into frenzied states or paralyze weaker demons with terror. The bloodthirster's massive gnarled axe, dripping with the essence of countless slain foes, was swung in arcs meant to tear apart anything in its path. Yet none of its calculated brutality had prepared it for the sudden appearance of Ghost Rider, a being whose flames were not just heat, but an expression of judgment, punishment, and supernatural inevitability. The initial clash began with the rider approaching at unimaginable speed, leaving trails of hellfire across the battlefield. The bloodthirster reacted instinctively, swinging its axe to intercept, expecting the attack of a mortal Xenos or even lesser demon. Instead, Ghost Rider's chains lashed out with uncanny precision, wrapping around the demon's limbs, torso, and weapon. The chains, searing with flames that were not of the warp, but of another, unholy dimension, began to constrict, testing the bloodthirster's formidable strength. The demon roared, a sound that seemed to shake the ground itself and resonate across the warp, yet the chains did not falter. Each movement of the rider was deliberate, calculated, and yet infused with the chaotic energy of vengeance, striking in ways that both punished and neutralized without hesitation. The bloodthirster's axe clanged against the burning metal of the chains, sparks erupting from the contact, but each clash left the demon momentarily staggered, forced to reconsider its approach against a foe that defied conventional understanding. The battlefield itself reacted to the duel. The ground beneath the combatants cracked and smoldered, fissures opening to release plumes of toxic fumes and bursts of fire. Craters formed where the chains struck, searing the earth with flames that burned not just flesh but essence. Lesser demons, drawn by the immense power radiating from their champion, hesitated, sensing that this was not an ordinary opponent. They cowered, fled, or attacked with reckless abandon, their actions guided by instinctive fear rather than command. Ghost Rider, moving with supernatural agility atop his motorcycle, used the environment to his advantage. Lashing chains that wrapped around pillars of stone, remnants of fortifications, and debris to leverage force, redirect attacks, and manipulate the battlefield with terrifying efficacy. Even the bloodthirster, used to commanding terror and chaos, found itself reacting defensively, forced to adapt in real time to a combatant whose skills transcended traditional physicality and conventional martial logic. The bloodthirster's fury escalated, wings beating violently to create gusts of destructive wind, axe swinging in arcs meant to obliterate all in its path. Yet Ghost Rider's approach was relentless. He moved unpredictably, sometimes appearing above the demon, sometimes behind, sometimes at impossible angles, his chains and hellfire striking without warning. Each lash of the chain carried the force of judgment, searing Khorne's champion and temporarily disrupting the flow of its warp-fueled power. The bloodthirster, used to demoralizing enemies through sheer presence and the promise of inevitable slaughter, found that its usual psychological tactics were ineffective. Ghost Rider's calm, unyielding focus and supernatural aura instilled neither fear nor hesitation, but a peculiar kind of inevitability, as though the demon itself was subject to a law it could neither violate nor escape. As the duel progressed, the bloodthirster attempted to escalate the engagement, summoning waves of raw violence and attempting to channel Khorne's unending rage into devastating attacks. Its every swing and roar sought to overwhelm Ghost Rider with the sheer magnitude of divine fury. Yet the rider anticipated each movement, countering with combinations of speed, fire, and chains that seemed almost prescient. The hellfire surrounding him did not merely burn. It disrupted the essence of the bloodthirster, interfering with its connection to the warp, weakening the potency of its energy, and forcing it to rely increasingly on brute physicality. Each counterstrike from Ghost Rider left the demon destabilized, staggering under the weight of a force that was neither mortal nor fully demonic. A being whose power operated according to principles entirely alien to Khorne's creations. The physical clash was matched by a spiritual and metaphysical tension. Ghost Rider's presence carried an innate judgment that resonated across the warp, challenging the bloodthirster not only in body but in essence. The demon, which had been forged in blood and war, found its existence questioned by an entity that acted as the embodiment of vengeance. Every swing, every lunge, every lash of the chain was a confrontation, not merely of strength, but of moral authority and cosmic principle. Lesser demons watching the engagement could sense this struggle, their forms flickering, their wills bending, as though even their loyalty and rage were being scrutinized by a higher law. They could neither define nor resist. The duel drew the attention of nearby forces, including orc warbands, Imperial units, and other demonic entities. All bore witness to the confrontation with a mixture of awe and terror. Orcs, instinctively drawn to the fight, surged forward only to be incinerated or swept aside by the chains and fire. Reinforcing the dominance of Ghost Rider, Imperial forces, observing from a distance, recognized a battle that transcended mortal strategic comprehension. Understanding that even the most formidable weapons of the Adeptus Mechanicus would likely be insufficient against such a foe. Chaos cultists and minor demons, witnessing the bloodthirster falter, were gripped by fear and doubt, realizing that their god's champion was vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. Despite the overwhelming power of the bloodthirster, Ghost Rider maintained control of the battle with a relentless precision. He did not seek to destroy indiscriminately, nor did he act out of malice. Each strike, each lash of his chain, carried intent and judgment. The demon's fury, which had obliterated worlds and armies, was met with an order that was supernatural, unyielding, and absolute. As the duel continued, the battlefield itself seemed to bend to the rhythm of Ghost Rider's assault. Flames licking the edges of craters, debris spiraling through the air, and the roar of the bloodthirster punctuated by the echoing crack of Hellfire chains. The confrontation became more than a simple contest of strength and skill. It was a clash of cosmic principles, the raw embodiment of rage, chaos, and violence in the bloodthirster against the supernatural force of judgment, vengeance, and punishment embodied by Ghost Rider. The very fabric of reality seemed to ripple and bend with every exchange, and those who watched from nearby could sense that the outcome of this encounter would have implications far beyond the immediate battlefield, reverberating across the galaxy through mortal and demonic alike, challenging assumptions about power, inevitability, and the nature of cosmic justice. Space Marines, the superhuman defenders of the Imperium, were among the first organized forces to attempt engagement with Ghost Rider, and they quickly discovered that conventional tactics and weaponry were nearly useless against his supernatural abilities. Entire chapters mobilized in response to reports of a flaming, skeletal figure moving across multiple worlds, leaving trails of fire and destruction in his wake. Strike cruisers descended from orbit, their drop pods streaking toward the surface, bolters ready, flamers primed, and tactical squads prepared for rapid insertion. Commanders expected to confront an unknown Xenos or demon incursion, perhaps a rogue psyker or corrupted warband. But nothing in their extensive training had prepared them for a being whose very presence defied conventional warfare. Ghost Rider did not move according to conventional strategy, did not respond to intimidation or firepower, and seemed to perceive the intentions and guilt of those who confronted him with a precision that left even seasoned veterans unsettled. Initial attempts at engagement quickly revealed the limitations of the Space Marines' formidable arsenal. Bolter fire, laced with explosive rounds designed to obliterate Xenos and heretics, often passed harmlessly through the rider or was deflected by his Hellfire aura. Plasma weapons, capable of vaporizing even heavily armored vehicles, produced bursts of heat and light that seemed to energize the rider's supernatural momentum rather than impede him. Even power swords and chain swords, the signature weapons of close combat squads, met resistance against an opponent whose very body seemed impervious to mortal damage. Each failed attempt only heightened the confusion and caution among commanders, forcing them to reconsider conventional battle plans and defensive strategies. Tactical formations that had been drilled for centuries, designed to maximize firepower and survivability against overwhelming odds, proved insufficient. The natural discipline, cohesion, and combat efficiency of the Adeptus Astartes were challenged by a foe who operated outside the known laws of reality. The psychological impact on the Space Marines was profound. Soldiers who had faced tyrannid swarms, orc-waghs, and demonic incursions alike reported feelings of disorientation, awe, and even fear when observing Ghost Rider in action. The rider's flaming skull, chains ablaze with supernatural fire, and the eerie, inevitable way he moved through the battlefield created a sense of moral reckoning among those who confronted him. Many Space Marines, though genetically enhanced and indoctrinated from youth to face the horrors of war without hesitation, felt the weight of judgment emanating from the writer, an intangible force that assessed their intent, valor, and guilt in ways that no commissar or chaplain could emulate. Those who hesitated, even for a moment, were quickly reminded of the writer's precision, as chains and flames punish not only the guilty, but sometimes the reckless, creating an environment of constant, unnerving tension. Strategically, the presence of Ghost Rider forced Space Marine commanders to alter their approach. Direct assaults, frontal charges, and conventional encirclements were largely ineffective. Instead, they attempted more subtle tactics, coordinating multi-directional attacks, employing ambushes, and using terrain as cover, hoping to contain or trap the rider. Scout squads were dispatched to observe his patterns, but the rider's movements were unpredictable and rapid, often appearing in places where no mortal could have anticipated, crossing open plains, dense urban zones, and even fortified installations with ease. Dropships and land speeders were often forced to abort missions mid-flight as Hellfire erupted in their paths, leaving commanders scrambling to maintain cohesion under conditions that defied both planning and expectation. The rider's supernatural speed and agility compounded the challenges faced by the Space Marines. Even those augmented with enhanced reflexes and rapid response training found themselves outmaneuvered. Ghost Rider could leap great distances, manipulate his chains to strike from unexpected angles, and navigate vertical and horizontal spaces with seemingly impossible precision. Combat squads that attempted to flank or surround him were often met with counterattacks that defied comprehension, as chains and Hellfire intersected with perfect timing, disrupting formations and leaving openings that the rider exploited with relentless efficiency. The result was a battlefield in which the Space Marines' usual superiority in combat was negated, forcing them into reactive rather than proactive engagement. Astropathic support and psychic amplification were also attempted, as commanders sought to use mental and spiritual resources to anticipate and counteract the rider's actions. Astropaths attempted to project warnings, telepathic commands, and premonitions of danger to their troops, while librarians sought to manipulate the warp to restrain or damage him. Yet these attempts were met with mixed results. Ghost Rider's presence seemed to interfere with psychic currents, diminishing the effectiveness of even the most powerful librarians and disrupting astropathic projections. Some reported visions of fire, skulls, and chains overriding their communications, creating confusion and occasionally terror among squads relying on psychic guidance. It became evident that the rider's power was not merely physical. It operated in the metaphysical and psychic realms, simultaneously assessing intent, punishing aggression, and maintaining an unyielding momentum that could not be easily countered as battles wore on. Space Marine leaders realized that conventional metrics of strength and superiority were inadequate against Ghost Rider. Engagements had to shift from pure force to careful observation, improvisation, and rapid adaptation. Combat doctrines were revised on the fly, with units relying heavily on coordination, redundancy, and environmental manipulation rather than sheer firepower. Even then, success was limited. The rider's interventions altered the course of engagements in unpredictable ways. Entire squads found that their targets were destroyed or punished before they could even engage, or that the battlefield itself became a hazard, with flaming trails, broken terrain, and supernatural chains forcing rapid adjustments. The moral and spiritual dimension of Ghost Rider's presence also affected the Space Marines deeply. Chaplains and sergeants found themselves struggling to maintain discipline and focus, as the rider's aura imposed a sense of accountability that was nearly tangible. Acts of cowardice, recklessness, or excess violence were sometimes punished by fire and chains, instilling a heightened awareness of conduct and responsibility in the ranks. This was not simply fear. It was an understanding that the battlefield now contained a force capable of enforcing judgment beyond mortal authority. And even the most disciplined Space Marine felt the weight of this presence. Interactions with other forces on the battlefield, including Imperial Guard units, orcs, and minor chaos elements, further complicated the Space Marine strategies. Ghost Rider's interventions disrupted the balance of engagements, often neutralizing threats, sparking unanticipated conflicts, or changing the priorities of enemy forces. The Space Marines had to constantly recalibrate their tactics in response, attempting to coordinate with allies while accounting for the Rider's unpredictable yet purposeful interventions. Commanders quickly recognized that survival and effectiveness now depended as much on adaptability and observation as on strength, training, and firepower. As every encounter with Ghost Rider introduced variables that defied conventional calculation, through these trials, it became evident that Ghost Rider was more than an adversary. He was a force that reshaped the battlefield, tested the limits of Space Marine skill and strategy, and introduced a level of unpredictability that required constant vigilance. His presence forced even the most battle-hardened veterans to reconsider assumptions, adapt doctrines, and confront a power that could not be measured by conventional means, fundamentally altering the nature of engagement across multiple war zones. The Imperium, vast and unyielding, faced an unprecedented challenge as Ghost Rider continued his relentless journey across countless worlds, leaving trails of fire, judgment, and supernatural disruption in his wake. On one heavily industrialized Hive world, the Adeptus Mechanicus first encountered the unique difficulties posed by his arrival. Forge complexes that had been producing tanks, titans, and countless munitions for centuries experienced sudden, localized surges of energy that fried circuits, melted metal, and rendered even the most advanced servoskulls and magos constructs inert. The flames that accompanied Ghost Rider were not ordinary combustion. They seemed to burn both matter and spiritual corruption, a force that even the Mechanicus, with their unparalleled knowledge of machine and arcane processes, could not fully comprehend. Engineers and tech priests attempted to deploy defense measures, plasma turrets, and automated gun platforms, but their efforts were consistently nullified by the Rider's supernatural speed and precision. Each strike of his chain, each flare of Hellfire, neutralized machinery with an efficiency that suggested both tactical awareness and metaphysical purpose. The planetary governor convened an emergency war council, bringing together representatives from the administratum, local PDF regiments, and Mechanicus liaisons. Reports from across the Hive world described phenomena that defied conventional explanation. Entire manufactorums consumed in flames within moments. Convoys immobilized as tires, engines, and even anti-gravity drives melted or warped. And psychic impressions of judgment and terror radiating from a single spectral figure. Soldiers who had trained their entire lives to fight Xenos or heretics were unprepared for a foe that operated outside conventional metrics of threat assessment. Chaplains, attempting to rally morale and invoke the Emperor's blessing, found that prayers and litanies had a variable effect on the Rider, sometimes seeming to echo in resonance with his purpose, while other times leaving soldiers even more unsettled, acutely aware of their own sins, hesitations, and failures. Astropaths aboard orbital monitoring stations reported anomalies that blurred the line between the warp and material reality. The psychic readings associated with Ghost Rider did not correspond to any known signature of demonic or mortal origin. His presence distorted conventional psychic measures, producing surges of energy that could blind sensors, scramble communications, and temporarily disrupt navigational arrays. Even experienced psychers on the planet felt the weight of his gaze, as though their very thoughts, intentions, and unresolved transgressions were exposed. Those who attempted to telepathically probe or communicate with him found themselves assailed with visions of fire, skeletal faces, and chains. A constant reminder that the rider's power was both physical and metaphysical. Military tactics were forced to adapt in real time. PDF units, initially deployed to protect civilian zones and critical infrastructure, were ordered to establish defensive perimeters, relying on conventional cover, firepower, and suppression techniques. Yet these measures proved insufficient. Ghost Rider moved across open terrain and urban environments with supernatural agility, seemingly able to anticipate troop movements before they occurred. Strategic points, such as ammo depots, communication hubs, and vehicle storage yards, became unpredictable sites of destruction, with the rider appearing where least expected. Even when artillery strikes were called down from orbit, the flames and chains seemed to dissipate or divert the attacks, rendering massed firepower largely ineffective. Commanders recognized the necessity of integrating rapid reconnaissance, evasive maneuvers, and predictive observation. But even the most carefully laid plans were frequently undone by the rider's unpredictable yet purposeful path. Civilians, trapped in the urban sprawl of Hive Cities, experienced the full terror of Ghost Rider's presence. Unlike conventional battles, which could often be observed from a distance or mitigated by evacuation protocols, his arrival left little time for preparation. The heat of his Hellfire ignited buildings and industrial complexes, while the chains he wielded struck with a precision that defied expectation. Despite the chaos, some civilians noted an odd pattern. Those who had committed acts of violence, corruption, or betrayal were more likely to find themselves directly affected by the rider's wrath, while innocents often escaped unharmed. This selective pattern created a sense of both fear and awe. As the Imperium's citizenry attempted to reconcile the supernatural, judgments being enacted amidst the destruction of their daily lives, the Adeptus Mechanicus, recognizing the limitations of conventional weaponry, attempted to integrate advanced technology and psychic augmentation into their defensive strategy. Servo skulls equipped with plasma weaponry, energy barriers, and automated defense turrets were deployed to track, anticipate, and engage the rider. Yet even these enhancements proved only partially effective. The chains of Ghost Rider wrapped around these constructs, tearing them apart with supernatural force, and the Hellfire burned through energy shields and armor plating as if they were mere paper. It became increasingly clear that no amount of conventional augmentation, however sophisticated, could match the combination of speed, judgment, and metaphysical power that the rider brought to the battlefield. The Imperium's forces began to observe patterns in his movement and targeting. Ghost Rider appeared to operate according to a principle of judgment rather than conventional strategic or tactical logic. Corrupt leaders, abusive officials, war profiteers, and traitorous elements were struck with relentless precision, while units engaged in direct defense or protection often went unscathed. This behavior baffled commanders who had expected indiscriminate destruction or aggression, forcing a reevaluation of engagement doctrine and the adoption of flexible strategies that accounted for the unpredictable selective targeting of the rider. Chaplains interpreted this as a manifestation of divine justice, while administrators debated whether this was an unknown emissary of the Emperor or an anomalous entity that demanded study and observation. The psychological effects on the Imperium's forces were profound. Soldiers reported heightened awareness, nervous tension, and an almost compulsive introspection regarding their own actions and responsibilities. Units previously desensitized by decades of conflict were unsettled by the sense that each decision, hesitation, or lapse could draw the attention of a force that judged beyond mortal comprehension. The presence of Ghost Rider created an environment in which moral and operational discipline became inseparable from survival, forcing even seasoned veterans to maintain constant vigilance, adaptability, and personal accountability. Observation teams noted interactions between Ghost Rider and other factions. Orcs, chaos cultists, and minor Xenos incursions experienced direct punishment or disruption as the rider traversed the battlefield. Orc mobs that charged with reckless abandon were incinerated or torn apart by chains. Chaos cultist rituals were disrupted or reversed, and Xenos forces found their coordinated attacks neutralized with precision. The Imperium learned quickly that Ghost Rider's influence could alter the dynamics of multi-faction conflicts, creating opportunities for exploitation, but also introducing unpredictable consequences. Commanders were forced to adopt real-time adaptation strategies, constantly reassessing priorities, predicting the rider's path, and mitigating collateral damage, while attempting to maintain mission objectives in an environment that operated according to principles outside mortal calculation. The combined impact of Ghost Rider's presence reshaped the battlefield across multiple levels, physically, through the destruction of infrastructure and units, psychologically, by instilling awe, fear, and moral reflection, and strategically, by forcing the Imperium to adapt operations in real time to accommodate a force that was neither ally nor conventional enemy. His arrival demonstrated the limitations of even the most disciplined, well-equipped, and battle-hardened forces of the Imperium when confronted with a supernatural entity capable of enforcing judgment, manipulating the battlefield, and operating beyond the constraints of conventional warfare, leaving commanders, soldiers, and civilians alike to confront a reality where fire, chains, and inevitability dictated the terms of survival and engagement. The Chaos Gods themselves took notice of Ghost Rider's sudden intrusion into the galaxy, an event that shook the foundations of their carefully maintained domains and disrupted the balance of power they had spent millennia establishing. From the twisting horrors of the warp, whispers of his presence echoed through the palaces of Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, each perceiving the rider differently, but recognizing immediately that he was a force that neither could command nor fully comprehend. Khorne, the blood god, felt a peculiar vexation. His avatars of rage and violence, from bloodthirsters to Khorne berserkers, faltered before an entity whose purpose was not mere slaughter but judgment. The chains and hellfire of Ghost Rider tore through the battlefield with surgical precision, striking only where corruption, malice, or cowardice was evident, leaving even the most bloodthirsty of demons frustrated and enraged. The blood god's roar echoed in the warp, demanding retribution. Yet even he found his fury blunted by a force that operated outside his domain of pure violence. Nurgle, the Plague Father, perceived the rider's presence as an affront to his slow, inevitable decay. Entire worlds he sought to corrupt with pestilence and rot were disturbed by flames that burned away both flesh and disease, purging corruption with a precision that defied the natural entropy he so cherished. Plague-bearers and demon princes that once acted with the assurance of immortality were struck down or thrown into disarray, their numbers reduced not by indiscriminate carnage, but by a meticulous force that punished excess, injustice, and cruelty. Nurgle's grotesque laughter turned to frustration as the rider's interventions undermined his long-term strategies, disrupting the cycles of infection and despair that he had carefully engineered across hundreds of planets. Even the diseased air and warped energies of his realms seemed to recoil slightly in the presence of the Hellfire, as if the natural order of corruption had been challenged by an alien force. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, felt a peculiar kind of irritation and fascination. His schemes, manipulations, and grand plots that spanned decades and manipulated countless mortal and immortal lives were exposed to a force that seemed capable of seeing through intent and predicting outcomes with an uncanny accuracy. Ghost Rider did not play into the intricacies of destiny or probability, nor did he bend to the manipulation of fate. Instead, he acted according to a principle that neither Tzeentch nor his sorcerers could fully predict. Every twist of chain, every flare of hellfire, countered manipulation with inevitability, unraveling complex plots and destabilizing the outcomes of carefully orchestrated events. Sorcerers attempting to harness the warp against him found their spells backfiring or redirected, leaving even the most cunning agents of Tzeentch in states of shock and disbelief, struggling to reconcile their intricate knowledge of causality with the disruptive force of the writer's intervention. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince of Excess, was perturbed in a more subtle manner. His pleasure and pain-driven manipulations, which relied on temptation, seduction, and the exploitation of desire, failed to sway or influence Ghost Rider in any meaningful way. Where Slaanesh relied on mortal weakness, indulgence, and obsession to entrap and control, the Rider appeared immune, a being whose focus and moral judgment cut through excess with clarity and precision. Her followers, accustomed to manipulating emotions, sensations, and ecstasy, found themselves powerless as the Rider punished acts of cruelty, vice, and corruption without bias, leaving a trail of chaos that disrupted the delicate balance of temptation across entire systems. The Dark Prince's frustration grew as even the most devoted cults found their operations foiled by an entity whose intervention seemed both targeted and absolute, leaving them to reconsider their influence and methods. The combined forces of chaos attempted to respond to Ghost Rider's intrusion with overwhelming power. Demonic legions, cultist armies, and warbands converged in coordinated assaults, seeking to overwhelm, trap, or destroy him before he could disrupt their operations further. Yet each encounter played out differently from their expectations. Lesser demons, normally fearless in the face of mortal opposition, were incinerated or ensnared by chains before reaching him. Greater demons, whose might and terror had crushed entire worlds, found themselves matched and countered, their attacks deflected, redirected, or punished in ways that challenged even their comprehension of strength and strategy. Cultists, who often relied on the favor and intervention of their gods, found that prayers, rituals, and invocations sometimes failed, leaving them vulnerable to the Rider's judgment. The metaphysical implications of his presence were immense. Ghost Rider operated on principles that challenged the hierarchy of chaos itself. While the gods were accustomed to mortals and demons acting in predictable patterns of corruption, desire, or violence, he imposed an external standard of accountability. Every act of cruelty, malice, or betrayal was met with swift retribution, disrupting the natural incentives that the chaos gods had created to maintain loyalty and obedience. This intervention destabilized entire warbands, causing infighting, hesitation, and strategic errors that reverberated across battlefields. Demons questioned orders, sorcerers doubted their power, and mortal followers became uncertain of their survival in the face of a force that judged not by allegiance or strength, but by action and intent. Even the pantheon of chaos, who thrived on unpredictability and rebellion, could not ignore the threat. Advisors, heralds, and avatars convened within the warp to assess the Rider's impact and formulate strategies. Yet each plan was undermined by the same qualities that made Ghost Rider unique: speed, precision, and a seemingly innate understanding of guilt and corruption. Attempts to summon greater demons in overwhelming numbers often failed, with entities either being destroyed upon arrival or redirected in ways that neutralized their effect. Entire campaigns orchestrated by the Chaos Gods were destabilized as Ghost Rider moved through battlefields, passing judgment and leaving chaos that was unaligned to any one deity's intent, an unpredictable variable that neither worshippers nor demons could control. The psychological impact on chaos followers was significant. Cultists, previously confident in the protection offered by their gods, began to fear retribution not only from mortal authorities, but from a force whose purpose transcended allegiance. The Chaos Gods themselves seemed to grow increasingly concerned with the disruption of their plans, perceiving Ghost Rider as a force whose influence undermined the reliability of their power over mortal and immortal agents alike. As each battle unfolded, The forces of chaos were forced into defensive postures, constantly adjusting to counter a foe whose principles of judgment and vengeance were inscrutable yet inescapable. This constant pressure altered the behavior of the demonic and mortal servants of chaos. Bloodthirsters, plague-bearers, and demon princes were forced into reactive strategies rather than offensive campaigns, while cult leaders hesitated to engage in acts of cruelty or betrayal for fear of attracting the writer's attention. The subtle, pervasive fear induced by his presence undermined morale and cohesion, causing strategic paralysis in some cases and reckless desperation in others. Even the Chaos Gods, who thrived on manipulation and strife, recognized that the writer's existence introduced a new paradigm, one that neither could ignore nor directly control, forcing adjustments across their domains and influencing the outcome of conflicts in ways previously unimaginable. The arrival of Ghost Rider within the Imperium's most sacred and fortified bastions marked a confrontation unlike any in the galaxy's long and violent history. When the flaming skeletal rider appeared on the Hive world of a major ecclesiarchy stronghold, the initial confusion among both the clergy and the local PDF units was profound. The echoes of a roaring motorcycle reverberated through the vast, gothic corridors of the cathedrals and manufactorums, accompanied by the scorching trails of Hellfire that left scorched paths through streets, rooftops, and holy statues alike. Chaplains immediately raised alarms, calling upon prayers and litanies to invoke the Emperor's guidance. Yet the aura surrounding Ghost Rider seemed impervious to such spiritual interventions. His presence radiated a divine yet alien judgment, one that challenged the Imperium's assumptions about faith, power, and the authority of the God Emperor himself. Space Marine chapters stationed on nearby orbital platforms scrambled to respond, mobilizing strike cruisers, drop pods, and rapid response units. Commanders issued orders for containment, expecting an unknown Xenos incursion or demonic infiltration, but Ghost Rider's nature defied conventional classification. His flames did not burn in the conventional sense, and his chains moved with a precision and intent that no mortal or enhanced soldier could predict. Entire squads found themselves outmaneuvered in moments. Bolter fire and plasma rounds seemed to evaporate in the presence of his supernatural speed and the aura of judgment that enveloped him. Tactical formations that had been honed over centuries proved ineffective, forcing commanders to adapt strategy on the fly while maintaining order in squads facing a foe that existed outside both mortal comprehension and the established hierarchy of the battlefield. The writer's first engagements with Adeptus Astartes units demonstrated a terrifying efficiency. Tactical squads attempting to intercept him were met with chains that ensnared limbs, weapons, and vehicles, yanking them apart with an unyielding force. Hellfire erupted along streets and barricades, consuming everything from power armor to armored vehicles with ease. Librarians attempted to employ psychic powers to restrain or counter him, yet the writer's metaphysical nature disrupted warp energies in ways they could not fully anticipate. Psychic shields and wards flickered under the influence of his presence, while even the most disciplined Space Marines felt a moral weight pressing upon them, as if the writer were judging not only their actions in combat, but the very essence of their convictions, deeds, and hesitations. The civilian population of the Hive City became immediate witnesses to his inexorable path. Unlike a standard incursion, Ghost Rider did not act with indiscriminate malice or aimless violence. His flames and chains punished those guilty of corruption, oppression, and cruelty, while sparing innocents caught in the chaos of urban warfare. Officials who had abused power, industrial lords who had exploited laborers, and heretical priests attempting to manipulate or deceive were singled out with precision, their fates sealed in fiery judgment. Civilians, while terrified by the destructive display, began to perceive an order within the chaos, a sense that justice, though terrifying and absolute, was being enacted by a force beyond mortal comprehension, the Adeptus Mechanicus, responsible for maintaining the Hive world's industrial output and technology, quickly realized the inadequacy of conventional defenses. Automated turrets, servitors, and power-harnessed machinery proved ineffective against the Rider. Bolters and flamers, designed to decimate Xenos and rogue psychers, were met with supernatural countermeasures, while even the most intricate war machines melted or malfunctioned when exposed to the Hellfire trails. Magos engineers attempted to deploy experimental containment devices and energy barriers, but Ghost Rider's chains often disrupted these systems before they could engage, leaving defense lines fractured and the battlefield increasingly chaotic. Reports from senior tech priests emphasized that no amount of machine precision could match a force operating on principles that transcended both technology and mortal comprehension. As the battle escalated, the Rider's supernatural agility became apparent. He traversed the vertical and horizontal architecture of the Hive City with impossible speed, appearing atop spires, crashing through streets, and even leaping between towering manufactorums with unerring accuracy. Units attempting to flank or surround him were consistently outmaneuvered. Chains wrapped around vehicles, turrets, and armored squads with mechanical yet supernatural precision. The battlefield itself seemed to bend to his will, as flaming trails, falling debris, and shifting terrain disrupted the Imperium's strategies. Commanders struggled to maintain operational cohesion, relying on improvisation and rapid communication to minimize casualties and protect critical infrastructure while attempting to anticipate his next movements. The Rider's presence had profound psychological effects on Imperial forces. Even the most battle-hardened space marines, trained to face tyrannids, orcs, and demonic entities without hesitation, reported a palpable weight of judgment in his presence. Chaplains and sergeants found themselves compelled to exert discipline and moral clarity, as each misstep, lapse, or act of cruelty seemed to attract the attention of an inescapable force. PDF units, accustomed to enforcing order and quelling riots, experienced heightened tension and introspection, realizing that conventional fear and command would not protect them from the Rider's assessment. This created a battlefield environment where physical and moral vigilance were inseparable, forcing soldiers to act with precision, courage, and awareness beyond their standard training. Engagements with enemy forces present on the Hive world chaos cultists, minor demonic incursions, and opportunistic Xenos highlighted the Rider's unique method of intervention. He disrupted coordinated attacks with pinpoint accuracy, punishing acts of cruelty, betrayal, and corruption while leaving defensive or protective actions largely unscathed. Chaos cultists attempting ritualistic empowerment were incinerated or ensnared before spells could take effect, while minor demons found themselves trapped or dispersed by flaming chains. Orc mobs that surged through industrial districts were shredded, their crude firepower irrelevant against the combination of speed, fire, and judgment. The Rider's interventions reshaped the dynamics of multi-faction conflicts in real time, forcing the Imperium's commanders to constantly adjust tactics while attempting to maintain objectives in an unpredictable and rapidly evolving environment. The metaphysical dimension of Ghost Rider's actions was particularly evident in engagements with ecclesiarchy, leaders, and corrupted officials. Prayers, blessings, and ritual invocations had unpredictable effects. Sometimes they seemed to resonate with the Rider's sense of purpose, occasionally sparing certain individuals or reinforcing their survival, while at other times they highlighted acts of hypocrisy, corruption, or moral compromise, leaving the guilty to face immediate and irreversible punishment. The spiritual authority of the ecclesiarchy was thus challenged indirectly, as the Rider's judgment operated outside traditional channels of divine or imperial sanction, forcing clergy and leaders to reevaluate the nature of righteousness, responsibility, and justice within their domains. Observation of Ghost Rider by Imperial strategists indicated that his movements and interventions were deliberate rather than chaotic. He targeted acts of aggression, malfeasance, and moral corruption with an almost surgical precision, disrupting key enemy operations while leaving allies largely unharmed. This required commanders to adopt a flexible, reactive approach, constantly recalculating the consequences of engagement and reassessing priorities to accommodate a force that operated independently of conventional warfare principles, yet profoundly affected outcomes. The presence of Ghost Rider forced an integration of observation, adaptation, and moral vigilance alongside traditional tactical considerations, fundamentally altering the nature of Imperial operations on the Hive world and across the surrounding sectors.